Gulf, the Making of an American Sea. Jack, good morning and welcome to KTRS.
Good morning. It's my pleasure.
I'm kind of intrigued. I was trying to get my arms around, the book, knowing that you grew up in the Gulf of Mexico area and what you were trying to accomplish by writing this book. I'm just curious, just to get the ball rolling here.
Well, as you said, I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico, so I had this intimate relationship with it, and nobody had written a history of the Gulf, so it seemed like an ideal subject for me. I'm an environmental historian, and that's the approach I wanted to take. But also the 2010 BP oil spill, that 87-day summer nightmare we all experienced in 2010. Really, it took a lot from the Gulf, not just birds and fish and other wildlife, and it robbed the Gulf of its identity as far as I'm concerned, and that gave me my objective to restore the identity of the Gulf and to tell readers that all Americans have this connection with this Gulf, with the Gulf of Mexico, whether you've lived beside it or whether you've visited it or not.
There's another section of the Gulf too that I think is worth noting, and that would be, especially since we're not that far from the Mississippi River, which obviously ends up down New Orleans way and out once it finally empties into the Gulf of Mexico. We have this huge dead zone that's been created because of fertilizers and pollutants and that sort of thing. I guess that touches on your same subject from an environmental viewpoint, that mankind tends to come into places and basically spoil the environment when they show up.
Yes, that's part of the story, and that's what I mean by all Americans are connected to the Gulf in some way, and for many of them, it is those rivers that run to the Gulf, and from the U.S. states, some 69 rivers drain into the Gulf of Mexico, and the Mississippi drains a sizable portion of the United States. So anything that you put in the ground, say in Minnesota or Iowa, that finds its way into a stream will eventually, more than likely, find its way into the Mississippi River and down to the Gulf of Mexico. And unfortunately, more often than not, that's agricultural runoff, fertilizer, as you said, industrial waste, but also raw sewage. There's still some quote-unquote sewage treatment plants that are dumping raw sewage into the bays and the streams and the rivers that finds its way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and that's devastating for the estuarine environment. And the dead zone is exactly as you described it. It's a dead zone. Marine life cannot live there. And in the summertime, it expands to the size of the state of Delaware, sometimes even Connecticut, if it's a particularly hot summer.
You take in your book, which is called The Gulf, the Making of an American Sea, you take us through the history, with Spanish and English first venturing along the Gulf of Mexico, and you even touch upon Hurricane Katrina, and as you were talking about oil disasters. So growing up along the Gulf, how do you see that? How do you see it?
Well, I see it, the Gulf is healthier, or at least the inshore waters are healthier than they were when I was growing up. In the 1960s, 1970s, many of the major bays and bayous and sounds were very close to becoming dead bodies of water. They had lost the majority of their seagrass. And that, in those days, was largely because of raw sewage. And we've done a wonderful job of cleaning up those bays and bayous and restoring their seagrasses, which are vital to the estuarine environment. And I should point out that the Gulf of Mexico is one of the richest estuarine environments in the world. So we have this wonderful gift in our backyard. So we have the capacity to allow nature to come back to life as long as we step back and do the right things and we respect it. But we've continued to fail in other ways. Galveston Bay experiences over 200 toxic spills a year. We already talked about the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. There's a little dead zone off of the Penn Holloway River in Florida because of a cellulose plant that since the 1950s has been dumping dioxins down this 26-mile river that end up in the Gulf of Mexico. So while we've done this really wonderful job of cleaning up the waters around the Gulf of Mexico, there are other areas that we can focus on and we can do better.
Jack Davis, thank you very much for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
You're quite welcome. Thanks for having me.
Jack Davis, the author of The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea. Some interesting comments on his part, also talking about the fact that there are some positives that have occurred over the course of the years, that the raw sewage problem is being somewhat abated, although here in St. Louis, as we're all aware, when we get overflow rainfall and the sewage system can't handle it, we're just dumping raw effluent into the Mississippi, which goes down to the Gulf of